Hello, this is Jessica Williams once again, here to read my book, The Gateway to Imagia, The Tale of Sam Little. I am going to continue the story, and today we'll be starting with Chapter 6. I believe we're going to be doing about 2 chapters that I'm going to be doing today, so hopefully I will have a couple of them up, so those of you that have been following along will have a couple to read, or I guess listen to, in the next couple of days. So we're going to go ahead and get started and read Chapter 6, Nightmare. After what could have only been hours, signs of the seemingly ever-present daylight began to fade into a perfect evening. Without his watch to give him proof of the time he'd been gone, Sam was only half certain that his time here had crossed the limit he had originally set for himself. Of course, this consumed only a fraction of the thoughts he was now riddled with. It was difficult to linger on something so insignificant as time, when this had, hands down, been the most amazing thing he had ever experienced or done in his entire life. The amount of creatures that he had already seen, combined with the sheer, unfathomable size of this world, was enough to keep the attention of anyone. 4 unlikely travelers were now inside what could possibly be the very heart of the forest. Kisa was easily the best at making her way through the constant foliage and obstacles. If the brush became too thick, she would merely climb the nearest tree and delicately balance her way through the branches until she had found an easier path. Yetus's size was his only advantage. Pure brute strength aided his passage, knocking large limbs and heavy vines out of his way for Sam and Taryn to pass. But it wasn't Kisa's gracefulness or Yetus's notable power that impressed Sam. Now that his rescuer wasn't crouching on the ground or leaning on a tree, Taryn was much more remarkable. Sam was small and used to everyone looking so much taller than him. Taryn wasn't only tall, but also very strong. His clothes looked roughly made, like someone Sam might picture stepping out of a Robin Hood movie. He carried a quiver of arrows on his back, with an elegant bow to match. His shirt was short-sleeved, displaying his muscular arms. If heroes really existed, he figured that Taryn would fit the part. But most amazing of all was his seemingly intimate knowledge of the world around him. It was as though this was Taryn's world, and not Sam's world at all. He had some difficulty getting through the thickest spots of the forest, but mastered it regardless. This was proof of one thing. He had obviously been here before. Sam, of course, could barely keep up most of the time. He had done so much already today and was starting to get exhausted from the never-ending adventure. He would have normally been atop Yetu's shoulders, but the low-hanging branches made it difficult. After bumping his head for the 4th time, Sam opted for walking. It would be much less painful. He started to drag his feet and found himself tripping over random roots or tightly woven weeds. The longer he drudged on, the more he would even trip over his own feet. His constant strains of "ow" and "sheesh" drew the attention of the rest of his traveling party. Kisa would stop and ask frequently if he was okay to go on, and Sam would always nod his affirmation, despite the fact that he was dead on his feet. Yetus was now wearing a constant look of concern for his small companion. He obviously preferred that Sam be riding instead of walking. Taryn felt sympathetic towards him. He understood that Sam was young and could see that his energy level was wearing quite thin. He slowed up enough that he could talk to the exhausted boy. "Hey, kid," he smiled down at Sam. Sam smiled feebly in return, but the tiredness nearly overshadowed his attempt. You think you have another 2 hours in you? I really wanted to get to a good clear area of the forest to make camp. It would be much safer there." The word "safer" struck some hidden nerve deep inside of Sam, but he was far too tired to let it bother him. The mere idea of walking for another 2 hours was exhausting, so the act of doing so itself couldn't possibly be any better. But regardless of the way he truly felt, he looked up to Taryn into his kind face and answered him. "Yeah, I think I can make it. I've never been on an adventure this long. I think my feet are just needing to get used to it. He smiled tiredly once more. Taryn furrowed his brow and thought for a second. He was certain that Sam was putting on a brave face so they could continue and not appear weak. He understood this more than Sam knew. He saw through Sam's brave facade and called his bluff. Really? Because you look to me like you're about to pass out again. Taryn cocked an eyebrow and waited for Sam to notice that he wasn't convincing anyone. Then teasingly, he added, and, that could really slow things down a bit, you know? Sam took a mental inventory of each face now looking at him. Was he so unconvincing? He really had tried his hardest to keep up, but his small stature was barely able to get through high grass, let alone thick forest underbrush. He suddenly felt defeated and stopped in his tracks. Each of them, as if expecting this, stopped in turn. Well, he sighed, I guess I'm getting pretty tired. I really am trying, though. Can't we just sit down and rest for a little bit? It might help, Sam said. He felt himself blushing at his inability to keep pace with the rest of them. It was school all over again. He always had trouble keeping up with the kids in gym and on the playground. His imaginary world was the only place where he could be the fastest and the strongest. No one said you weren't trying, said Taryn. We can slow down a bit more, but this isn't exactly the best place to sit idly by. The forest is thinning already, or maybe you haven't noticed. Perhaps Yetus can give you a lift when we break through this last dense area. Taryn pointed ahead of them, and there was a definite thinning of the masses. Looking ahead, it still seemed so far away. Sam really was feeling the aches of the day, now that he stopped to think about it. The look on his face must have betrayed his sense of pride, because Yetus walked up to Sam and started to grumble something to him. The worry in his tone was obvious even to the others, and Sam looked up to Yetus and cut him off in mid-growl. No, you don't need to do that. You need both your hands to get through this mess anyways. Taryn and Kisa asked in unison, What did he say? Sam's face creased with a slight frown, and without looking up from his feet again, he translated. He wants to carry me in his arms until we can get to a clearer section of the forest. But he shouldn't have to do that. I can make it, really. If we could just rest a little bit, then we could keep on going. Sam folded his arms across his chest, making him look younger than he wanted to come off. Taryn tried to hide a silent chuckle. He knelt down to Sam's level and tried to reason with the stubborn kid. It's really not such a bad idea. And if you're worried about the extra burden on him, then you don't need to be. No offense, but you don't look exceptionally heavy. I'm sure he can handle it. When Sam didn't look convinced of his reasoning, he added, Heck, I could probably carry him myself if I wasn't so sure Yetus could do it easier. Kisa purred her encouragement of the idea. You look absolutely exhausted, Sam. Sam interrupted her with a hissing sound of disagreement. I'm not exhausted. I just need a little break. Kisa was gazing down to him from the branches above. To Sam's surprise, she clucked her tongue, sounding just like a patronizing adult. Oh, it's been a long day for someone so young. There is no shame in letting him carry you for a short while. You have such a strength for a little cub. I wouldn't have expected more from you than I expect from my children, and you have already gone so much further. I, too, would carry you myself, if it were possible, but I really am no beast of burden. Sam was touched by her comparison of him to one of her cubs, but also a bit offended at the idea of being compared to something so small and helpless. He was too tired to argue this point. He stared at the laces of his tennis shoes as he thought about his suggestion. It was an embarrassing thing to have to be carried like a baby, but the sheer idea of it already sent spasms of hopeful relief to his aching body. After a moment's hesitation and one triumphant look from Yetus, he nodded stiffly and said, Fine. But just for a few minutes. This whole trip is my stupid idea anyway, so I shouldn't be complaining about anything. His irritation from the combination of lack of sleep and being ganged up on was starting to show. Yetus reached out for Sam before he could change his mind and picked him up. He cradled him in one big hairy arm. He lumbered on through the trees in the fading light of evening. It barely slowed him down. Now, what he couldn't move out of the way was with only one hand. He used his powerful shoulders to shove through, and Sam could see the relief of his friends now, but also noticed a smirk on the edge of Yetus's face when he half glanced at him. This minuscule look sent Sam into a series of under-the-breath mumblings. More than once he muttered, "This is just stupid." Eventually, his silent ranting ceased. The sounds of the forest were changing as well as the colors surrounding them. The trees began to fade into cool grays and greens. It was easy to feel that the temperature was no longer a blazing summer heat, but was more comfortable now. There were fireflies twinkling around them, while the soft whispers of the forest nightlife began to fill the air. And though Taryn's words of warning of the safety of the forest teased the edges of his mind, Sam couldn't see how that was even a glimmer of a possibility. His body began to relax as it swayed to the rhythm of Yetus's gait. He hadn't realized just how incredibly tired he was until this moment. He yawned hugely. Taryn was walking inches from Yetus. Sam could see the triumphant grin when he looked over. As determined as he was to stay awake and not miss a single moment of his time in this world, his eyes were twice as determined to close. He nestled his head deeper into the soft fur and felt his eyes grow heavier. He could smell the familiar earthy scents of the forest and the thick hair, and it relaxed him. Try as he might, his mind couldn't muster keeping his eyes open any longer, so he lost the battle and drifted to sleep. For the second time in this new world, Sam found himself dreaming. It was peaceful. The images that he saw were not familiar to him. At first it was merely the forest that he had just left behind in his consciousness. Then, through the trees, he saw a boy, much like himself, running next to a strangely beautiful creature that was more human than it appeared at a glance. As they ran, they were almost dancing through the sunny forest. He could hear the boy laughing as he followed the sound. Sam had caught up to them just as he saw the creature swoop the boy into its arms. Now that they were still, he could see the creature more clearly and could tell that it was a woman, or as close to a woman as she could be without actually being one. She had soft, glowing gray eyes and long silver hair. Her gentle face was full of nothing but adoration for the small boy as she hugged him tightly. She was obviously too beautiful to be completely human. She shimmered in the sun as though she were carrying a light inside of her, and she wore a long, simple dress of brilliant white. She had elf-like ears that pointed out through her long locks of hair, and on her back were two beautiful wings that reminded Sam of an angel. As he stared at the two, he felt strange. It was as though he were an intruder in someone else's home. He felt like a spy and wondered if they knew that he was watching. She had put the boy down, and they were now standing in the sun. As he watched them smile and talk to each other from a distance, he longed to go closer and hear what they were saying. But his innocent intrusion lasted only a moment longer. Just as Sam had made his decision to go to them, the boy suddenly stiffened and turned to stare back at him. The innocent smile washed from his face when he saw Sam staring back. That same peaceful boy now looked disturbed and furious, his face contorted. His eyes were daggers meant only for the person that had dared intrude his serenity, and they pierced Sam's soul. Even though he could tell that his naive intrusion had become a dangerous standoff, he still felt compelled to watch the scene unfold. The beautiful creature that had once been smiling for her precious boy was now shrouded in fear. Her face fell, and her gray eyes turned black as she reached out hopelessly for the boy. She was being swallowed by the darkness that now covered everything. Sam blinked, and her inviting white glow was gone, replaced by only the image of the boy, who was now becoming one with the darkness. He suddenly broke eye contact and jerked his head to look behind Sam into the looming trees. Instinct took over and Sam turned around to look too. Something was lurking in the shadows. He could hear the echoing cracks of twigs and branches as some hidden monster advanced on them. He turned his head to see if the boy was feeling the same things he was, only to see that he was gone, leaving nothing but shadows in his absence. He only had a moment to wonder what happened to the boy before he could hear the low rumbling growl of the danger approaching. The creature was there in front of his very eyes. It was as massive as a rhinoceros, and its fanged teeth were bared, and the stench that it emitted was foul, like stale blood and rotted wood. Its sickly yellow eyes followed Sam's every movement as he slowly backed away. The creature closed the space between them, crouched like a lion hunting its prey. Thick, matted hair, darker than the shadows themselves, covered every inch of its body, straight down to its four-clawed paws, and the creature was menacing, spawn from evil thoughts. As Sam stared back with wide eyes, the beast opened its jaw to sound a blood-curdling roar. The sound pierced Sam's very thoughts, and he tripped, falling onto the ground at the feet of the monstrosity. He couldn't move any more. He didn't know if anyone could hear him over the roars, but Sam let loose a scream like no other. Something in him begged for it to be over, and he didn't understand the feelings that drowned out his will to run. He could feel the hot breath on his face as the creature opened its mouth to strike. He was waiting for the pain of the deadly jaws to close around him when, all of a sudden, he could feel two huge hands forcing him to stand up. He recognized them immediately. He then felt another set of smaller hands shaking his shoulders harshly. "Wake up, Sam! Wake up!" Taryn yelled. Sam opened his eyes, and once again he was screaming. The moment he recognized that the horrendous sound was actually coming from him, he stopped and blinked his eyes. He was standing in a clearing of the forest. It was well past dusk now, and he could smell the faint odor of wood burning. Yetus was holding him up, while Taryn was kneeling in front of him with his hands still on Sam's shoulders. Kisa was staring at the scene from the side with a worry in her trio of blue eyes. Her ears were twitching in every direction, as if searching for something that the others couldn't hear. As he took in the scene, Sam noticed that he was also panting for air, as though he had just been running a race, and he was sticky with sweat that trickled down his face. Taryn's eyes were serious, and Yetus was biting his bottom lip as he continued to hold Sam into place. But more than anything, he felt confused. He wanted to know why he was screaming again, and why everything he had dreamt seemed to be so real. As he stood there catching his breath, he couldn't seem to make himself speak the words he was so desperately thinking. Taryn was the first to break the edge of silence. "Are you all right? What did you see?" His sudden, urgent words did nothing but confuse Sam further. He still struggled to form the words, and they came out slightly broken. "Yes, I'm okay, I think. What happened?" Sam looked to each of his concerned party in turn, attempting to find clues to his puzzle. Taryn looked intently into Sam's eyes and then heaved a heavy sigh of relief. Apparently relieved about something, he dropped his hands from their place on Sam's shoulder and glanced at Yetus briefly before he decided to answer the question. He stood up and backed away so as to give Sam more room, as Yetus, too, let go his protective grip on him. Kisa had also calmed her disposition slightly and seemed just as intent as the others as to what Taryn would say. After brushing the back of his hand across his forehead, Taryn spoke. "Yetus was carrying you, and you fell asleep. We got to the clearing about an hour ago and decided to make camp so you could rest until morning. Yetus made you a place to lie, and things were fine until he laid you down. I had gotten a fire started when all of a sudden you, He stopped and looked concernedly at Yetus for a brief moment before continuing. Sam looked back eagerly. "Well, at first you just started to thrash around on the ground, like you were being attacked by something, and I figured it might be a nightmare. But then, without any warning, you started screaming. We couldn't get you to wake up, so Yetus forced you to stand, and we did everything we could to snap you out of it." The floodgates of questions opened and drowned Sam's silent bewilderment of the situation. Once he opened his mouth, the questions were free-flowing. So that's when you woke me up? After I started screaming? He didn't stop to wait for the answers. Why was I screaming like that? Or how about this? What could make me scream like that? I've never felt anything like that before. I mean, wasn't it just a dream? What the heck just happened to me, Taryn? He gasped for air after blurting out his desperate strain of questions. Taryn took 2 steps back and stared at Sam with a raised eyebrow. Something about what Sam had asked seemed absurd to him. He shook his head. Sam started to open his mouth to ask another question when Taryn held up a hand to silence him. "You were having a nightmare." Sam still didn't seem to grasp why he was screaming. But if it wasn't real, then why did I feel like I was really there? I mean, I could hear and smell and see everything. I've had dreams before, and I don't remember them feeling like, well, anything like that. Not a dream, Sam. It was a nightmare. The more real it feels, the more convincing it is. The more convincing it is, the more scared you get, and everyone here has them. And they can be quite terrifying. There was something more to his voice with that last remark. It wasn't Taryn's tone that caught Sam off guard. A word that he had used caught him by surprise. Scared. Sam had never put the feelings together before this moment. A look of realization swept his face as he considered what he had just heard. The knee-locking sensations, the feeling of helplessness, the need to cry out for someone. All the feelings began to make sense. But at the same time, it was incredibly confusing. He looked up at Taryn and said, "Oh, so you mean that's why I was screaming? I was scared?" Yatus placed his huge hand on Sam's shoulder and squeezed gently to make his presence known. Taryn looked at Sam as though he wasn't sure what he was seeing, but it was Kisa who was the first to comment on Sam's realization. "You say that as though you've never felt fear before. Were you not afraid when you were nearly swallowed by the Deceptor? Did I not scare you when you first heard my angry calls from inside that trap?" Sam had never considered the feelings that he was so perplexed by to be a simple fear. He had never in his whole life remembered feeling scared of anything. His eyes unfocused, and he placed himself back into the memories of his time since walking into the forest. And it was so obvious now, and he felt strange now that he understood. "I guess I never felt afraid before I came here. I remember feeling like I couldn't make my feet move. It was kind of like they were glued to the ground or something, and my heart was going really fast even when I wasn't running." Taryn still had an eyebrow raised at Sam, and he replied to him, "Yes, that would be fear. You were afraid, and that was why you were screaming. That was why we woke you up." "Oh." "But I must admit that I've never had so much trouble waking someone up from a nightmare. I know they seem real because I've had some pretty nasty ones myself, but I'm curious." Taryn's sentence drifted off as he considered something to himself. "About what?" asked Sam. Taryn finished his thought. "What exactly was it that you saw?" "Oh, well, it was this thing. Some kind of hairy creature that smelled really bad and was huge, like the size of a rhino. Have you ever seen something like that before?" Taryn laughed. "There are a lot of huge hairy things around, in case you hadn't noticed." After a fleeting glance at Yatus, he continued to listen as Sam struggled to explain what he saw. "I can picture it in my head still. It was so real." Sam faded off into the comfort of his mind. His eyes lost focus as they strayed into the dark woods beyond the fire and the mysterious shadows that it cast. He closed his eyes and pictured the beast, clear as day, approaching him from the darkness of the trees. He could already picture those horrible eyes and the powerful jaws surrounded by that long, matted hair. He could hear the twigs cracking and the bushes moving, just as he had in his nightmare. All of a sudden, Taryn shouted, "Yatus, grab Sam!" The sound of a bow being armed, along with a long hiss and a growl from Kisa, forced Sam's eyes back into focus as he snapped them open, unsure what he'd missed. Before he could absorb the situation, he was being lifted from his feet as Yetus placed him high into a tree, as high as he could reach. Yetus flipped back around and crouched into a defensive position under the branches that Sam desperately clung to. Kisa flanked him while Terran stood, armed and ready for whatever was barreling through the trees towards them. Sam's stomach twisted into a knot at the sudden turn of events. The sounds were getting closer by the second, and he jerked when Terran aimed a warning shot into the darkness. Terran's eyes must have been much more keen than Sam's, because the arrow hadn't missed its mark. The dull thud was followed by a piercing howl, and the forest moved with more anger as the very creature that Sam had dreamt of broke through the tree line into the glow of the fire. It was massive. Standing now on its hindquarters with its fangs bared, it reached up with its claws and ripped the arrow out of its shoulder. It dropped down to all fours and growled as it looked at the three obvious threats, and as it took another step closer, Terran shot another arrow. It flew straight and true, striking the beast in the chest. It shrieked in agony. Terran already had another arrow aimed, and before the beast could react to the last blow, he shot again. This time, it struck the neck. Sam sat still as stone as he watched his friends in mortal danger below him. As Terran drew his bow back again, the creature ducked and lunged forward, and this time his aim had failed. Kisa sprung with stealthy precision. She darted around the creature and attacked it from behind. As fast as lightning, she was on its back, sinking her teeth into the matted hair. The creature stopped in its tracks and roared in pain, shaking Kisa off its back. She was already backing into position with Yetus and Terran, and Yetus refused to move further away than an arm's reach to Sam. The beast had stopped now, as if considering its next move. Terran shot 3 arrows, each hitting another part of the target. The beast threw its head back and howled into the forest. It bared its fangs once more, before retreating back into the trees. No one moved from their positions. They could hear the creature's faint howling as it got further and further away. Terran was still aiming an arrow into the dark, as the last howl was nothing but a whisper of an echo. "Well, that's a new one. Never seen one of those before." Terran broke the silence, making everyone jump in alarm. Sam sat in the trees and gulped loudly as he looked at his protectors below. He knew now that what he was feeling was sheer fear for the events that he had witnessed. This new feeling was going to take some getting used to. And in a barely audible whisper, he said, "I have. That was the thing from my nightmare." The 3 looked up to him from below. "What did you say?" asked Terran. Yetus reached up to retrieve Sam and place him gently on the ground. Terran looked at Sam as though he was looking into the face of another one of those creatures. Sam swallowed again and explained what he'd said. "That thing, it was the same creature I was telling you about right before it attacked us. It's the same from my nightmare." Terran looked back into the forest for a long moment, and then back to Sam. With what could only be described as fear, he looked into Sam's eyes and said, "You mean you were picturing it in your head right before it attacked?" "Yeah." "Would you say you were imagining it?" Sam thought about it. "Yeah, I guess so." Terran shook his head, confused. "How did you do that?" "Do what?" Sam asked. He was getting confused again. Terran continued to stare at him nervously. "Sam," he said, "don't you know what you did? You just made that creature appear out of nothing, from your imagination." All right, that is the end of chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope you've been having a good time listening to my book as we've been going along for these several weeks. I'm going to go ahead and release a couple of chapters, maybe 3, I'm not sure yet, in the next couple of days, but definitely today I will have chapter 6 and probably chapter 7. If you guys are following along and reading, feel free to leave me a comment in the section. Let me know what you're thinking. I'd love to hear what your opinion is or how much you've been enjoying it, or maybe not at all. Let me know. Other than that, I will see you guys next time. All right, thanks. Bye.